did the revolution mean to America exactly? Was it a social revolution? Was it going to change who was in power, other than the fact that it would no longer be Britain? Was it a political revolution? Would it change our form of government? Ultimately, it was a conservative revolution. I don't mean in the political sense of as the Republicans are conservative, but a conservative revolution because what these people really wanted was to go back to the way things used to be. They wanted to go back, remember, to the pre-French and Indian War days. Their kind of utopia, or their good old days, was 1754, before Washington marched off in the Ohio River Valley, back when England left them alone. But of course, in reality, it did transform America in every way. Some of these ways intended, some of them not intended. So let's talk about life during wartime. Let's talk about loyalists. Somewhere between 20 and maybe 30% of the colonists remained loyal to England. Who would do such a thing? Well, if you held offices in the government, you probably were loyal to England. You were, in fact, the British government that was being rebelled against. Many merchants who had lots of business dealings with the British would remain loyal. A lot of backwoodsmen remained loyal simply because they didn't really know what was going on. They didn't get a lot of news, and they had always thought of themselves as English citizens, and they didn't know much about this revolution. The Loyalists were hounded by the Patriots fairly mercilessly, and oftentimes their stuff would be destroyed or taken from them, and they would be treated kind of as prisoners in some situations. About 100,000 of them run away. They leave the colonies during the time. Remember, there's only about 3 million people in the colonies total. In fact, some of these will leave America and become the first large settlement of English speakers in Canada. Canada still spoke French for the most part, at least the white people there. Some of them actually came back to the colonies after the war, came back to the United States actually after the war, but most did not. Anglicans and Quakers were another group who saw their position substantially weakened. Anglicans because they were the official Church of England, so you can imagine they weren't real popular. And Quakers because Quakers, of course, believe in absolute peace under all circumstances. They're total pacifists, so they refused to participate in the war. And if you can imagine if you were somebody who did participate in the war, this can make you very angry. Presbyterians, Congregationalists, and Baptists all adopted the Patriot cause officially. These are churches who officially joined with the Patriot cause. And so they did quite well. The revolution was good for them. Catholics were actually helped by the war because the Catholics didn't like the British government to begin with, right, because of all the religious trouble. And so they were some of the early supporters of the religion were Catholics. And in fact, America will be rewarded for this with its first bishop in 1789. Let's talk about the slaves. Many slaves were freed by the British. For example, in South Carolina, we believe about 1/3 of all slaves were freed and then given the chance to fight for the British Army. The slaves initially were very excited about all this talk of freedom and equality and, no government without representation to do it, hoping that it might apply to them, but of course it didn't. There was some limited success. Manumission laws, which is to say that you could choose to legally free your slaves, which had been illegal, were passed in Virginia by Jefferson, by the way, Maryland, Kentucky, Tennessee, New York, New Jersey, but they were rarely ever used. Pennsylvania became the first state to ban slavery entirely, and by 1804, all northern states banned slavery, although, of course, all southern states protected it. The South argued that the blacks needed slavery, that they simply could not take care of themselves, that if they had been freed, they wouldn't be able to feed themselves because, of course, this is based on this notion of racial inferiority. Besides, the South pointed out, if you really wanted the whites in the South to free the black people, who was going to do all the work? And so this was a very persuasive argument, particularly if maybe you weren't very rich because you saw the slave's life and you realized, well, if they get freed, then that would be me. And which is why many white Southerners supported slavery. The international slave trade was limited fairly substantially in the early days after the war. Another group that's going to be affected by the war, of course, are Native Americans. Originally, they sided with the British as the colonists were expanding, and the British were trying to stop them. And so the Indians, the Native Americans, the British were better for them because they were trying to keep the colonists out of their land. And when the British lost the Revolutionary War, it was a disaster for Native Americans. Some colonists argued they should be eradicated, exterminated like some sort of pest. Others, like Thomas Jefferson, for example, called them noble savages and had great admiration for them, although this meant that he wanted to help them out by making them live like white people. So that didn't really do them a lot of good because they weren't interested in that. Women during the fighting took on men's roles. If your men went off to fight in the war, somebody had to run the farm, and a lot of times that was women. And many of them were very good at this. There was a lot of women impressed very much in this role. Although, of course, others weren't, and they fell into poverty. It was a case-by-case basis. The army had camp followers, which sometimes means prostitutes, but not necessarily. In fact, in this case, it was probably more women who would follow the army and wash their clothes and maybe help prepare the food or tend to the sick and the wounded. And these women played an important role in maintaining the army because those jobs are all incredibly important. Many women also hoped that freedom meant that they would get some freedom too, that they would begin to gain some equality. In fact, John Adams' wife Abigail would write, "In the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I would desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than you were your ancestors." It didn't work. Adams and the other founding fathers did not show more kindness to the ladies and their ancestors. In fact, coverture continued. Now, coverture is a doctrine that says that all a woman's legal rights basically fall under her husband, so her right to own property or testify in court or file government documents. Basically, all that had to be done through her husband or her father. There was some progress for women with the idea of the Republican mother. And this is the idea that a great part of a democracy was an educated population. And of course, women raised the little boys, and the boys needed to grow up to be able to read and do math and things so they could be good voters in a democracy. And so women were actually educated to the point where they could help the boys with their schoolwork. And so we begin to see women getting to do things like go to grade school and learn how to read and write. It may not sound like much to you, but it was progress for the time. In the short term, the revolution was an economic disaster. I think we can argue in the long term it was great, but in the short term it was a real problem. Not only was there no manufacturing, very little money, and very little industry generally, there was no more British Navy to protect American shipping. American ships had always been protected by the strongest Navy in the world, and now in some cases are being attacked by them. British ports were closed to the Americans. We could no longer trade with British ships, British ports, and that was a real problem. Americans responded by, of course, beginning to develop industries, although this is a slow process, and beginning to trade with the Caribbean and Asia since it became more difficult to trade with Europe.